The sound of the bell echoed through the hallways of Elmwood High School, signaling the start of a new term. Mrs. Helen Grant, a veteran English teacher with a reputation for strictness and a sharp tongue, stood at the front of her classroom as students shuffled to their seats. She had been teaching at Elmwood for nearly 2 decades, and she prided herself on her ability to maintain order and discipline in her class. As the last few students filtered in, a new face caught her attention. Maya Johnson, a recent transfer from the inner city, entered the room with her head held high but a nervous flutter in her stomach. She was the only black student in the class, and her presence stood out amidst the predominantly white and privileged student body. Maya quickly found an empty seat, feeling the eyes of her peers on her as she moved through the classroom. Mrs. Grant's sharp gaze followed her as well, her expression unreadable, but with a hint of something Maya couldn't quite place. "Well, well, we have a new student," Mrs. Grant said, her voice carrying an edge of false cheer. "Maya Johnson, I assume?" She scanned her roster and then looked up, adding, "I do hope you can keep up with our advanced curriculum here at Elmwood." Maya met her gaze, suppressing the nervousness bubbling inside. "Yes, Mrs. Grant," she replied politely, but she could sense something more beneath the teacher's words, a cold judgment she couldn't yet explain. Mrs. Grant nodded briskly and turned to the board, beginning the day's lesson on The Great Gatsby. But Maya knew from the way the students were whispering and glancing at her that this would be no ordinary first day. As Mrs. Grant dove into the lesson, discussing wealth and ambition in The Great Gatsby, Maya tried to focus, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every so often, she would catch someone staring, some students curious, others hostile. When the students were instructed to break into groups for a discussion, Mrs. Grant made it a point to pair Maya with Jake Matthews and his friends, the popular kids who ruled the social hierarchy at Elmwood. Jake, tall and arrogant, was known for his quick wit and biting sarcasm. Maya had heard about him even before she transferred. As the group sat down to discuss the novel, it quickly became clear that Maya was not welcome. Jake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking. "So, new girl, what do you think Gatsby's real deal is? I'm sure you've got some unique perspective," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Maya frowned but kept her voice calm. "I think Gatsby represents the illusion of the American dream and how it's unattainable for certain people, no matter how hard they try." Jake snorted. "Yeah, sure. Or maybe he's just a guy who got lucky." The others in the group laughed, and Maya could feel her frustration rising. She knew she had more to contribute, but it was clear that her opinions were being dismissed before they even had a chance to be heard. Mrs. Grant observed from across the room, a faint smile playing on her lips. Maya noticed, but said nothing. She could already sense that Mrs. Grant wasn't just strict, she had an agenda. As the days passed, Maya's frustration deepened. Mrs. Grant's cold demeanor toward her was becoming more apparent, and the microaggressions started to build up. Every time Maya raised her hand, Mrs. Grant either ignored her or offered condescending feedback. The subtle but continuous undermining of her participation was eroding her confidence. One day, during a discussion on the theme of racial inequality in To Kill a Mockingbird, Maya finally spoke up. It was a topic she felt deeply connected to, and her thoughts were well researched. "I think Harper Lee uses the character of Tom Robinson to highlight how the legal system is rigged against black people, and how deeply ingrained racism shapes outcomes for people of color," Maya said. Mrs. Grant's face tightened, and she immediately cut Maya off. "I think you're overcomplicating things, Maya. This is a story about justice, not just race. Maybe in some modern interpretations, people choose to focus on race, but you need to stick to the basics. Maya's face flushed, but she kept her expression neutral. The other students seemed uncomfortable, a few exchanging uneasy glances, but no one said a word. Jake, who sat a few rows behind, snickered and muttered something to his friends, loud enough for Maya to hear. "Guess it's hard to talk about anything else, huh?" Maya clenched her fists under her desk. The hostility was becoming unbearable. Behind closed doors, Mrs. Grant had always maintained a polished image. She was strict but fair, or so the administration thought. What they didn't know was that Mrs. Grant harbored a deep-seated bias, one she had carried with her throughout her career. To her, Maya wasn't just another student. She was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in her meticulously controlled classroom. During a staff meeting, Mrs. Grant complained to the principal, Mr. Fisher, about Maya's attitude. "She's always trying to bring up race in every conversation," Mrs. Grant said, shaking her head. "She disrupts the flow of the class. Honestly, I'm not sure she's a good fit for our curriculum. We hold our students to a higher standard here." Mr. Fisher, a well-meaning but oblivious administrator, nodded absent-mindedly. "I'll look into it, Helen. I trust your judgment." What Mrs. Grant didn't realize, however, was that her private conversation would soon have public consequences. Maya's father, Richard Johnson, a prominent civil rights lawyer, had begun to hear murmurs of his daughter's mistreatment. He had always encouraged Maya to stand up for herself, but even he didn't anticipate how bad things had become. That evening, Maya told her father everything. Richard listened quietly, his jaw tightening as Maya described the way Mrs. Grant dismissed her opinions, the sneering remarks from her classmates, and how the teacher subtly encouraged the exclusion. "We're going to fix this," Richard said firmly, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "I'll speak with the school tomorrow." The next day, Mrs. Grant was called into the principal's office for a meeting with Richard Johnson. As she entered the room, she found herself face to face with a man whose reputation preceded him. Richard stood tall, his presence commanding but calm. He was known throughout the city as a fierce advocate for justice, and Mrs. Grant quickly realized she had miscalculated. "Mrs. Grant," Richard began, his voice steady but laced with steel. "I understand my daughter has been having some trouble in your class." Mrs. Grant stiffened, her polished smile faltering. "Oh, I wouldn't say trouble, Mr. Johnson. Maya is adjusting. But I'm concerned that she might be bringing too much of her personal experience into academic discussions. It's disruptive." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Disruptive? Or is she simply challenging your perspective?" The weeks following the meeting saw little improvement in Mrs. Grant's behavior. While she no longer openly mocked Maya's contributions, her disdain for the girl was evident in every interaction. The tension in the classroom was palpable, and Maya could feel it pressing down on her every day. But Maya had grown stronger. The meeting with her father had empowered her to continue standing her ground, no matter how much Mrs. Grant tried to undermine her. She had started to build quiet alliances with other students like Clara, who had always been too scared to speak up, but had finally begun to see the injustice happening in front of them. Clara started sitting with Maya at lunch, and the two girls would discuss the literature assignments together. They bonded over their love for books and the frustration they felt toward Mrs. Grant's narrow-minded teaching style. One afternoon, as the two girls worked on a group project in the library, Clara admitted something that took Maya by surprise. "I've been afraid to say this for a long time," Clara began hesitantly, but I think Mrs. Grant has always had it out for students like you. You're not the first." Maya looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Last year there was another girl. Her name was Layla. She was Hispanic, and Mrs. Grant treated her the same way she's treating you. Layla ended up leaving Elmwood halfway through the year. No one talked about it, but I think she was bullied out." Maya was shaken by Clara's revelation. It hadn't occurred to her that Mrs. Grant's behavior might be part of a larger pattern. Determined to learn more, Maya and Clara began to dig deeper. They started talking to students who had been in Mrs. Grant's class over the past few years, collecting stories that painted a troubling picture. One afternoon, Maya and Clara met with Layla, the former student who had left Elmwood the previous year. Layla confirmed what Clara had suspected. "Mrs. Grant always had this way of making me feel small," Layla said, her voice tight with emotion. "Whenever I tried to talk about my background or bring up issues of inequality, she'd shut me down. She acted like my experiences didn't matter." Maya felt a surge of anger rise within her. This wasn't just about her. Mrs. Grant had been systematically silencing students of color for years. Armed with this new information, Maya knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She and Clara decided to bring their findings to the principal. But first, they needed more concrete evidence. They quietly gathered testimonies from former students, documenting the ways Mrs. Grant had targeted them. They also kept track of their own experiences in her class, noting every time Mrs. Grant dismissed Maya's input or encouraged the other students to ostracize her. The final straw came during a class debate. Maya was paired with Jake and his friends again, and as they discussed the theme of privilege, the great Gatsby asked. Jake made a cutting remark. "Maybe Gatsby just didn't work hard enough," he said, smirking. "You know, if you want something in life, you've got to earn it. Not everything's about race." Mrs. Grant, instead of correcting him, nodded approvingly. "An excellent point, Jake. People often forget that hard work and determination are the true keys to success." Maya's hands shook with rage, but she remained silent. She knew this was it, the moment she would expose Mrs. Grant for what she really was. Maya and Clara arranged a meeting with the principal, this time bringing Richard Johnson along. They presented their findings, the testimonies of former students, their notes on Mrs. Grant's discriminatory behavior, and the pattern of exclusion that had been allowed to persist under the school's watch. Mr. Fisher, the principal, looked uncomfortable as he read through the documents. Richard sat beside Maya, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "This isn't just a misunderstanding, Mr. Fisher," Richard said, his voice low but firm. "This is a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has gone unchecked for too long." Mr. Fisher shifted nervously. I had no idea things had gotten this bad. I trust Mrs. Grant's judgment, but—" "This isn't about judgment," Richard interrupted. "This is about institutional bias, and if you don't take action, this school is going to have a much bigger problem on its hands." The next week, an investigation was launched into Mrs. Grant's behavior. The school board, alarmed by the evidence, held a hearing with both current and former students, allowing them to testify about the mistreatment they had experienced under Mrs. Grant's watch. The testimonies were damning. One by one, students like Layla and Maya shared their stories, and the weight of their words became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Grant, once a respected figure at Elmwood High, was exposed for the harmful and biased educator she truly was. In the end, Mrs. Grant was forced to resign, and the school issued a public apology to the students she had wronged. Maya and Clara, now stronger and more united than ever, continued to push for changes at Elmwood, ensuring that no other student would ever feel the way they had. Elmwood High began implementing new diversity and inclusion programs, bringing in speakers and educators like Dr. Lewis, who specialized in addressing systemic inequality in schools. As Maya walked through the halls one afternoon, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The battle had been hard fought, but justice had been served. And with the support of her father, her friends, and her community, she knew that she had made a lasting difference. For the first time, Maya felt truly seen not just by her peers, but by a school that was finally beginning to change.